What's up, guys? B-Tom here, and after getting some compliments about some of my setups and generally just getting good feedback on how they feel from most people, I decided that it'd probably be a good idea to make a setup video, just explain what every parameter does, and then at the end I'll give some guidelines on what you would probably find as a good baseline setup for most tracks. So, hopping right into it, starting with the aerodynamics. Obviously, the higher the front wing, the more front grip you have, and higher rear wing, higher rear grip you have. However, uh, more downforce comes at the expense of more drag. So, obviously, you don't want to just run like 50-50 everywhere. You'd be a turtle in the straights. Um, Always want to find a balance between cornering grip and straight line speed. So, in terms of like wing gaps, anywhere between like 0, so like equal wings front and rear, to like 15 higher on the rear or 15 higher on the front, all of that works really well. It's just a matter of personal preference. I would say, generally speaking, what I've been doing is running slightly lower on the front than on the rear, um, just because it helps a bit with the balance of the car during the course of a race, because as the step progresses at most tracks, the rear tires ride faster than the fronts. There are some exceptions like Silverstone or China, where the fronts wear up faster, but just having the rear a bit higher than the front helps with making sure the balance stays a bit more consistent. So, um, yeah, that's what I like to do. And then another thing worth noting is that the front wing has a higher effect on the car's drag than the rear wing. And that's just because when the rear wing opens in the DRS zone, it's like basically the effect of having less wing. Um, so like, for example, 30-30 compared to like 30-35 in a DRS zone, it's very small. Um, Whereas like 30-30 versus like 35-30, um, you're just going to be slower everywhere on the straight. Whereas, with this, you're just slower on the straights with no DRS zones. So that's something to consider. Moving on to the diff. Basically, with the on throttle diff, the more locked it is, generally speaking, the better traction you might get, but it might also be a bit snappier. So, for example, if you get on the power a bit too hard, the car might have more rapid loss in traction, which would give you a bigger snap of oversteer. Um, but generally speaking, in this game, it's always better to run between 90 and 100. I would say it's 90% of the time going to be on 100. Cases in which you might see it on 90, like Jeddah. In Sector 1, it's all flat out, or pretty much mostly flat. In a race, it might be a bit different, but if you find yourself having a bit of understeer through that section, then you can open up the on throttle diff, and I'll just have the car rotate a bit more through that section. Then with the off throttle diff, this basically affects how much the car rotates on the corner entry, particularly in the low to mid speed corners. So, for example, at a track where you might have a lot of entry understeer because it demands a lot of front grip, like Silverstone, then you would want to open up the off throttle diff, try and get a bit more rotation. But if it's a track where, generally speaking, you have a lot of oversteer on entry, like Baku, because the rear tire was so high, then you'd want to lock up the rear diff. And that just makes sure that the wheels are more prone to rotating at the same speed, and that gives you a bit more stability on corner entry. With engine braking, always run that at 100%. This gives you the maximum braking potential of the car, and it helps you recover as much ERS as possible, which obviously in this game is a very critical element to your success. So never leave time on the table. Don't do anything less than 100. If I see anyone watching this video or who's watched this video running less than 100%, then we're gonna have a fight. But yeah, moving on to suspension geometry. With camber and toe, always run all the way to the left. You can go some clicks to the right on this, but I'd say it's generally a waste of time. All it will do is make the car equally good or just worse. So yeah, no point in messing around with this. It's a waste of time. Moving on to the front suspension and rear suspension. For the front, I generally always have it on 41. Just makes the car a bit more stable. And then with the rear suspension, having it low just helps with traction and overall stability. However, if you want a bit more responsiveness, you can go up to like 6. I don't really go higher than this just because it makes the car a bit more slidey, particularly on corner exit. Um, but it really just depends on what you do with some of the other setup parameters. So, like, if you have a lot of rear grip relative to front grip, then you could go up on the suspension and make the car very responsive on the entry, and then you've got enough rear grip to still put the power down quite quickly on the exit. Then with the roll bars, again, this ties back to what you do with the wings. For example, if you got the front wing higher than the rear, then you'll want this stiffer, and if you have the opposite, the front wing lower than the rear, then you'll want this softer. And basically, the wing gap affects how much rotation you have. So obviously, the front having more grip gives you more rotation, and the front being lower than the rear gives you less rotation. And you balance that out by having a softer front, which gives you a bit more rotation, and then a stiffer front if you need a bit less rotation because you have, a higher front wing. However, um, I wouldn't take this to the absolute extreme and try and like run, for example, like 1030. I don't know what track you would ever run that at, but this would just make the car understeer on the entry and then snap like crazy on the exit. So I'd say anywhere between 6 to 21 works well. Really just depends on what you do with the wings. Um, the more front wing you have relative to rear, the stiffer, and the more rear wing you have relative to front, then the softer you want to be on the front. And then for the rear anti-roll bar, I always keep it on 21. Just makes the car as responsive as possible in corner entry. And it doesn't really make the car skittish or anything like some of the other settings, like the suspension or running like a really high wing gap with the front higher than the rear. Moving on to ride height, I generally run between 20 and 60. The front ride height has an effect on how much front grip you have, mainly in the high speed and a bit in the mid speed. Um, However, if you run it too low, then you bottom out and you lose chunks of time in a straight. Or if you're at a track where you need to ride the curbs like Mexico, like turn 1, 2, and 3, if you run too low, you're just going to get launched and you can't really glide over them, which is pretty important for lap time. So you could run up to like 26. You might get a bit more understeer, but um, generally speaking, it's better to be able to mount curbs at the tracks that require it than have slightly more front grip um, in other sections. So the rear ride height is quite similar. I find if you go higher, you have a bit more rear grip, but it makes the car a bit more sluggish. Um, However, you can also play around with the suspension and anti-roll bar settings to sort of balance this out. But I would say don't run too low in the rear because the car will become skittish. So, for example, the flat right-hander in at the intersection 2 in Hungary, if you're too low in the rear, then the car will just want to stop on you mid-corner. It's something I had to learn the hard way recently. Um, but yeah, anywhere between 50 and like 65 works quite well. But I'd say for most tracks, 60 is probably the sweet spot. And then 20 on the front right head is the same. Um, it's like the sweet spot for most tracks. For brake pressure, always run 100. Similar to the engine braking, you always want to have access to the maximum braking potential of the car. And then with the brake bias, it's another thing that affects the rotation of the car on entry, mainly in the lower speed stuff. So, for example, if you're having entry understeer in low speed, you want to run more rearwards bias. And then if you're like rear locking and having too much under or oversteer, you need to run around like 56. That'll pretty much get rid of all rear locking in most cases. The extreme scenario is Baku because the rear tire wear is so high. That's a track where you'll always gonna run like 55 to 57 in the brake bias. Because it makes the rear slide less and it also has the effect on the tire wear. And as for tire pressures, I would always run max. There are some very rare exceptions where if you're running the hard tire, it might not get up to the temp range it needs to be in. And in that case, you'd want to lower the tire pressures. Though, um, if that is the case, you would want to lower them quite drastically because lowering it by like 0.1 psi will do absolutely nothing. So, um, yeah, there are very few scenarios in which you would need to do that. Bahrain's the only one that immediately comes to mind. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Always just keep it on max. And if you find yourself in that situation, then just lower the tire pressures. But that's pretty much it. I think I covered everything. So I'll just like make a baseline setup that would work well at most tracks and leave you guys with that. So 25-30 would work quite well. It's mid downforce, which is the case for most tracks in the game. Um, Gives you a bit of stability, and the wing gap isn't so high that you would need to do anything extreme with the roll bars. As for the transmission, on throttle, 100%. Just gives you maximum traction. Off throttle diff, 30% works quite well. It's a good compromise between having good stability on corner entry without having understeer. Engine braking, like I said earlier, is always 100%. These are all the way to the left, always. Front suspension, 41.1 works pretty well. 12.21, maybe go a bit softer, like 10.21 for 25-30 wings, but like 10, maybe even 8 to 14 would work well with that sort of wing level. And then ride height 2060 works well at the vast majority of tracks. Brake bias 154 is a good balance, and max tire pressures. So, um, if you're ever in need of a setup and don't know where to start, and the time trial setup just isn't working for you at all, then this is a good place to start and work from. So, yeah, that's it for me. Hopefully, you guys found this informative. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'll get back to them or back to you guys as soon as I can. And yeah, till next time.